In this video, we're going to cover one of the most important documents called the assumption log that we have to create and also update from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project during any project execution. So in this video, we're going to cover what is assumption log. We're also going to cover the elements or the key fields of the assumption log. We're also going to cover assumptions and also constraints. And also we're going to cover how to complete this assumption log. We're also going to cover alignment with other documents, that is the ins and the outs from the assumption log. And also we're going to look at tailoring the assumption log so that at least it's suited for a specific project. So let's get started. So you might have heard someone saying, what was the assumption? Assuming you're a project manager, you have now presented your project plan. Someone is asking you, maybe a project board member, what were the assumptions that you considered when you're planning your project? You have to be able to answer this question. So what are these assumptions? This is what we're going to cover in this particular video. We're going to understand. So let us look at the actual definition of an assumption log. All right. So as you can see on the screen, an assumption is a factor in the planning process that are considered to be true, real, or even certain without proof or demonstration. So let me explain on this. Assumption is something that you want to consider to be true, okay, to be real or not to be changing even during the course of the project. For example, you can assume that the equipment is going to be available on time. You can also assume that the same project team is going to be maintained throughout the project. You can also even assume that none of the expected risk in terms of, say, financial risk is going to be expected. So what it means is you are making something true without providing proof. So what does that mean? It means at one point or the other during the project, this has to be validated, and you should always put a date to validate the assumption so that you don't keep something which might end up being a risk, because an assumption can be noticed today. It can be also logged in the assumption log, but later on it can turn into a risk, assuming you were expecting the team to be the same, but now there are some resignations, some are being recalled back to some functional departments, and so on and so forth. So you end up with a risk. If an assumption is actually something that has already happened, then it becomes an issue. So it's quite important to understand that an assumption is something that is considered to be true, to be real, and also certain without providing any proof or any demonstrations. So that is very, very important. Then a constraint is considered to be a limiting factor that affect the execution of a project, such as predetermined budgets or fixed milestones. So let me expand a bit on this. Constraints, they're always everywhere. In every project environment, you always find some constraints. It could be a resource constraint, which could be a human or non-human. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget or budget. It could be a financial constraint, which could be budget. It can also be a constraint in terms of schedule. You're supposed to deliver something in 6 months. You can't go beyond that, especially when it comes to regulatory projects. You cannot go beyond a certain date because it's affecting probably the whole country or even the whole region that you're staying in. So constraints, you always find them. And constraints, they are always captured also during the project charter. So you might be asking, what is a project charter? A project charter is a document that is used to approve or to authorize the start of a project, and it's also used to give authority to the project manager and also to the project sponsor. If you want to understand more about project charter, I've created a full video on project charter. You can also watch it on my channel. I'll also leave a link in the description below. So you should be able to understand the distinction between an assumption and a constraint. An assumption is something that is considered to be real, true, or even certain without providing proof or even demonstration. And then a constraint is something that is a limiting factor, something that is not going to give you more flexibility in terms of what you want to do in a project environment. For example, it could be a schedule limit, it could be a budget limit, it could be even a team size limit that can also come, it could be a technical limit. So constraints, they all come in different categories. So you could be asking, Oscar, at what point do we capture or do we create this assumption log? The assumption log is actually created during the initiation stage of the project. That is creation. Get this right. Creation is during initiation of the project. However, when it comes to updating assumption log, it's updated from the initiation of the project all the way up to the end of the project. So do not make a mistake I've seen with some other project managers in the field. They just create the assumption log initially just to demonstrate to either senior management or to the client that they have assumptions. And then throughout the project, they become or they claim to be busy, and then they forget or they intentionally do not update the assumption log. Assumption log is supposed to be updated from the beginning of the project, during the project, and also at the end of the project. So you could be asking, at what can cause these assumptions to be updated? There are so many points or phases in a project where this assumption has to be updated. For example, when you're planning, which means you've moved from initiation to planning, there are a lot of assumptions that you have to consider throughout the planning process. Or even when you're doing procurement, there are also certain assumptions that you put into consideration. For example, if it's a software development project, you might also consider that during testing or even during cutover. So there are quite a number of points in a project environment where you have to consider the assumptions. And you should always come back to the assumption log, update it, and validate it, assign it to someone else, make sure there's also a date to make sure that the validation is actually done. So assumption log is something created during initiation, updated all the way up to the end of the project. So let us understand and appreciate why it matters to have an assumption log. So the first point that you have to consider is to reduce risk. So once you assume something, it gives you an opportunity to actually analyze it, to actually validate it before it becomes a risk. I can give you a good example. You can assume that, let me give you an example of a software project. So you might assume that the old servers, they are going to be, or old infrastructure is going to be used as part of the new project. However, during the project, you might discover, or you can be advised by the technical team, that there's a compatibility issue, which means the previous infrastructure or the servers, they can't be used in the new project. Therefore, you are forced to go for procurement to make sure there's availability of the infrastructure that you're going to use to run the software. So this is how the risk comes into play. You are assuming that you're going to use the existing infrastructure, but now you're forced to go to procurement. So the risk is the project is going to be delayed, likely, or you're likely going to exceed your budget, or you're going to expand your budget. So assumption log is actually very important to reduce the risk. You also have to drive action. Assumption log is also very important to drive action. What do you mean by this? When we assume something, you come up with an action plan to validate it, and even the dates to validate it, so that you're quite sure whether you're going to be continuing with that assumption, or you're going to close it, or you're going to put in place, if it's a risk mitigation activities or measures, to make sure that if it changes, it doesn't affect the project. So that is quite important to understand, that a assumption log is also used to drive action. Then, especially during the initiation stage, where you're creating probably a project charter, or you're identifying some stakeholders, it's also very important to use assumptions for alignment, because either the organization senior management or program managers or portfolio managers, they want to appreciate what was the basis of your estimates, what was the basis of your documentation, what was the basis of your requirements collection, as an example. So assumption log can also be used for alignment. You were, for example, you were gathering some requirements, and you assumed that the people who are giving the requirements, they are competent enough or they're experienced enough to provide the requirements as a complete set. That's an assumption. Assuming you got some new members in a department who are supplying or who are giving requirements, then definitely that assumption might not be valid for some time. So it's also used for alignment. Do not make a mistake that I've seen with some other project managers. They just update assumption log just at the beginning of the project. Assumption log is actually a living document. What do we mean by living document? A living document, it means it can be changed anytime. You don't need to go for change request to change assumptions. So it's one of the documents that is used during the project, and it's one of the documents that is also archived when the project is closed. So assumption is very important because in the next project or as part of the organization, it can also be used to pick some of the lessons learned that you're going to use or to update as you close the project. So take the assumption log as a living document. It's something that can be updated from the beginning of the project all the way up to the end of the project. I hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe button, and the notification button so that you're the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It will also help the channel to produce more videos like this one. So in this section, let us look at the common mistakes that you'll find when it comes to creating, updating, and also completing the assumption log. So we're going to look at common mistakes first, and then we'll look at how can you resolve them. So, so the first mistake is to have some vague assumption statements. So like I said, you should have very clear statements when it comes to assumption. What assumption are you talking about? It must be very clear. Don't use any vague statements. So how do you avoid that? You need to write in a single, testable sentence. For example, the client will provide test data by November 1st. Very clear. Nothing is vague there. So it's also very important that you consider the way you word, the way you create your sentence, the way you describe the constraints, the way you describe the assumption. It must be very, very clear. Then, the common mistake number 2 is no responsible part assigned. I can tell you, most project managers, they make this mistake. They create assumption log, no responsible part is assigned from the beginning. That assumption log is never updated. No one is ever going to transfer the assumption to either a risk or a log. Then when you face an issue, people are asking questions. How come this was never foreseen? Yet it was actually recorded in the assumption log. So a responsible part should always be assigned to an assumption log. Don't make that mistake of not assigning a responsible part to the assumption log. So every assumption must have a named individual, not a team or role. Who owns that? Don't say it's this department. Put the actual team member names. Remember we said assumption log is actually created mostly by the project team members. So put names. Who is going to be responsible for validating that specific assumption? Then mistake number 3 is no due date is set. Okay. So mistake number 2, mistake number 3, they go hand in hand. If you don't put a responsible party, you're most likely to be avoiding also or not putting the due date. So due date should always be also captured in the assumption log. The moment you put the responsible part, you put the due date. Due date is also very important to track progress. Are you on track? Are you not on track? Or how is it going to impact the other project activities? How is it going to impact the project objectives and also project goals? Say, for example, your due date is way after testing, as an example. So how is it going to affect? Is it something that is still valid? So it's quite important that you also capture the due date when you're capturing the assumption log. Then common mistake number 4 is treating closed assumptions as deletions. You should keep all entries, archive closed ones for project audit, trail, and lessons learned. So initially, you have assumed a specific item. Now you have validated that it has been proven to be true. Then you close it. It will also be helpful when it comes to capturing lessons learned. In the lessons learned, you want to have the do's and don'ts. And that assumption that we had closed, you can put it also as a lesson learned. Say, for example, you had an assumption that the equipment is durable for 5 years, and it has been proven that it is durable for 5 years. So it's a lesson learned that you can also share either with the next projects or next phases or even within the organization. So you can also capture it as a lesson learned. So you should not delete any closed assumption. Any closed assumption should just be archived so that it can be referenced later in future in the project. Then the last one, which is the fifth common mistake, is not updating after project changes. You should review the log after any scope change, a risk event, or major decision. It is a living document. This is very, very important. An assumption log is a living document. So what does it mean? Whenever there's a change in risk, whenever there's a change in scope, or whenever there's any change in plan, you need to review the assumptions that we have. What is it that you think you can add as an assumption into the assumption log? That is also very, very important. Don't treat it as if it's something that you just do at the beginning of a project or beginning of a phase, then you forget about it. It's something that you have to continuously review. Remember, also in some meetings, you also need to review the assumption log to see if most of these things are still valid. So it's a living document. It should always be updated continuously from the beginning of the project, during the project, all the way up to the end of the project. So let us now summarize the key takeaways from this session or from this video. So the first takeaway is the assumption log documents both assumptions, what the team believes to be true, and constraints, limiting factors from sponsors, customers, or regulators. Remember, we discussed that constraints can come from customers, sponsors, and also regulators. And also the assumptions can also come from the team, what the team believes is true, real, or even certain. Then also the second takeaway is every assumption must have an ID, category, clear description, responsible party, due date, action, status, and comments. We have covered these ones. We must always have a well-documented assumption log. Now, takeaway number 3, assumptions progress through 3 status values. So in this section of the video, we are now going to have a look at a symbol of an assumption log so that whatever we've discussed earlier, it actually makes sense. So let us go through this symbol so that we appreciate how it looks like, or we feel how it looks like to have an assumption log in a project environment. So let us have a look at this example where we are implementing a software implementation project. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, we have the ID and assumption, just say A001. You can put whatever ID you want. You can also use the organization's naming convention to come up with this. Or maybe we talk of the categories. On categories, we have, say for example, technical category. We also have a resource category. We also have budget category, external or internal category. You can also put it as a schedule category. So when it comes to the assumptions or the constraints, which we said it must be well documented, say for example, we take assumption 001. It means that the development server will be available from project kickoff. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for that? It's going to be the IT manager. And what is the due date? Remember, you have to put the due date. It has to be October 1st. And what is the status of the assumption log? Is active. You can also put the additional column we discussed earlier where you put the comments. Then if we look at assumption number 2, which is the resource, we have 3 full-time employees, FTE, developers, available full-time for 6 months. That's an assumption. So who is going to be responsible for this? This is going to be the HR director, as an example. And when is it going to be due? It's going to be due on 15th of September. And it's also active, which means the assumption is still under consideration. Then you also have the budget, as an example. The budget kept at 500,000. It's a constraint. It's not so much of an assumption. So who is responsible for that? Is the sponsor. And do we have a specific date? In some cases, it might not have a specific date because it's already known. So it becomes there's no due date. But in most cases, try by all means to put the due date. Then that is active. We look at external, okay, which is second from the bottom. We have the vendor API will remain stable throughout integration. That's an assumption. So responsible party is going to be the technical lead, and it's going to be due by 20th of October. This is transferred. So remember the 3 status we discussed on assumption. It's active, transferred, or it's closed. So if you look at assumption A003, this has been transferred. It means it has not been proven to be true. It has been proven to be false. So it's being moved to a risk log or even an issue log, depending. It cannot be on both. Risk is something that is expected to happen in future, but an issue is something that has already happened, or it's a risk that has already materialized. So this one is transferred. Then if you look at the last one, which is A004, which is a schedule category, it means the assumption here is user acceptance testing, which is VAT sign-off, requires only 2 weeks. Then the responsible party is the quality assurance lead, QA lead, is supposed to be due by 10th of November, and it has been closed. So which means if the assumption has been closed, it means it has been validated and it has been proven to be true. Remember, when you're making assumptions, you're not providing any proof, you're not providing any demonstration. So during the project, you still need to provide proof or demonstration to validate that assumption. So if you were able to prove the assumption to be true, then it becomes closed on the assumption log. If you want me to create more videos based on what we have covered in this video, you can also reach out to me, or you can let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching.